Even before a child arrives in the world, its parents are imagining the person it will become and the things that it will achieve. Core to these imaginings is the hope for the good health of their child, upon which every part of its life will depend. At this time, however, families are particularly challenged by child health issues, with everything from respiratory illness, like asthma, to neurodevelopmental conditions, like autism. While many on the autism spectrum go on to live full and accomplished lives, autism can impose a hefty burden on the child concerned and their family. This includes co-occurring epilepsy, depression, ADHD, sleeping difficulty, and self-injury. But what if there are paths to resolving at least some of autism symptoms, and in certain cases, even seeing an autism diagnosis reversed? My guest today, integrative pediatrician Dr. Joel Gator Warsh, says that such paths do exist and offers the example of two 2-year-old severely autistic twins and the results seen after various dietary and environmental changes were made. What medications and what toxins inside and outside the home may influence a child toward autism, and what can be done to potentially improve a child's autism symptoms. Welcome to Vital Signs, where we learn how to get healthy from all angles, from the biochemical and nutritional to the things we do that nourish our minds and our souls. I'm Brendan Fallon. Dr. Warsh takes an integrative medicine approach to treating his child and adolescent patients. He's the author of Parenting at Your Child's Pace, the Integrative Practitioner's Guide to the First 3 Years. Dr. Warsh, it's a pleasure to have you join us on Vital Signs today.
Thank you for having me on. I'm super excited to chat.
And apart from the fact that you're a very much sought after pediatrician, the fact that you're coming from the holistic side is immensely valuable to have your perspective on this show, because I know there's so much coming through in terms of nutrients and other holistic modalities in their benefit to children, not just with autism, but other neurodevelopmental conditions. Could you start just by giving us a snapshot of what the status quo as you see it with autism in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting and I think a little bit unfortunate topic. You know, we don't talk about it enough, but the autism rates are skyrocketing. I mean, if you look back a few decades ago, depending on which statistics you look at, it was like 1 in 25,000, somewhere within 1 in 1,000, and then it went up to 1 in 250, then 1 in 100, and now it's 1 in 36 and 1 in 22 in California. So the numbers are staggering. I mean, it's increased so much, especially over the last 20 years or so. And I get really frustrated because a lot of times when you talk about this, people say, oh, you know, we're just better at diagnosing it, and that's why. And of course, we are better at diagnosing it. So that's a small part of it. But you don't go in the last 20 years from like 1 in 250 or 1 in 100 to 1 in 22 without it occurring more. And especially when it comes to autism, it's not one magical genetic test that we can figure out exactly what it is. It's a diagnosis of symptoms, and we're looking at their communication, their social skills, their verbal skills, their repetitive behaviors, these kinds of things. And so any child that is manifesting with some of these symptoms, you can go to the practitioner, the therapist, or the psychiatrist, do the evaluation. And then if you meet enough of the criteria, you would call it autism. But that doesn't mean that autism is just one thing. Autism is the name that we give these symptoms or some of these symptoms. But I really think that it's a lot more than one thing. I think there are many things contributing to this. And especially when we're talking about autism and severe autism, 25 to 30% of children are nonverbal with autism these days. And so when people talk about this as, well, it's just so we're just better at diagnosing now. Well, where were those kids 30 years ago? Where were those kids 40 years ago? I mean, maybe they didn't have the label of autism, but then there would be a lot more kids with verbal issues and speech issues that would have been under some other category that don't exist. So that's why I don't believe that. I think it actually is just occurring more. And I think we need to get to the bottom of this.
Looking at some of your previous interviews to read, and I think this is something that will be very hopeful for many parents watching, this idea that in some cases the diagnosis of autism can be resolved. So I'm really interested to get into this with you soon about what that involves, what you've seen personally in terms of resolving autism symptoms. But before that, I think parents would also be very interested to know how much their contribution is to a child having autism even before the child is born. And I've seen that a parent's stress level in terms of the hormones like cortisol that might be involved can possibly influence autism. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. And to set the stage to answer both of those questions, I think we need to step back and talk about the controversy around autism because I think that's important. It depends on the framework that you come from. So some people say, autism, it's just a genetic condition. Some of the research shows that it's 80% genetic or all genetic. And so it doesn't really matter what you do. It's something that's just a genetic normal part of the spectrum. Like we're neurodivergent, it's a spectrum of mental status. And so this is, quote unquote normal. And we shouldn't necessarily look for anything that's causing this or contributing to it. I mean, that is a very common viewpoint that you see out there. It really doesn't look at the variety of what autism really might be. I mean, I agree, there probably are some kids that it's completely genetic and has nothing to do with our environment at all, and they get that diagnosis. But I think the reason why we're seeing it so frequently and so rapidly increasing is because a large portion of it, for many kids and many families, is environmental. And if we start to take that mentality of there are some things that we could be doing, or there are some things that we are doing that are contributing to this or even causing autism, then we can start to work towards improving symptoms, decreasing the autism rate, and helping these kids and families that want to be helped. I mean, there's so many families where they have children that are really struggling. The family's really struggling. They're hurting themselves or nonverbal, and they would do anything to help that child to be a little bit more resilient and have an easier life.
When we're talking about environmental factors, could you define that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, still controversial because nothing's really been proven. But if you look at the research that looks into autism, there are many different factors that might play in and are correlated with autism, like maternal age and paternal age, so mom and dad's age. So there are chemicals, like you mentioned, in pregnancy. So exposure to kind of any chemicals really there's some research and data around that, but metals, aluminum, cadmium, arsenic, there's been research around that. Lead, there's been research around that to show that could be related. Living close to a highway, there's some good research that shows that if you live within like a football length of a highway, you have an increased risk. There's been links to water and chemicals in the water. So there's just so many different studies out there that maybe show some links towards environmental factors, and nothing's really definitive at this point because I think a lot of the media is kind of pushing back on that and saying, no, it's just genetics. This is just what's happening.
And welcome to Vital Signs. I'm NTD health reporter and show host Brendan Fallon. If you're living with autism or have a family member affected by it, we'd love to hear about your experience. If you're watching on TV, you can find Vital Signs at epochtv.com to leave a comment. And if you're finding this video helpful, please be sure to share it with family and friends by clicking the share arrow below. And in looking at the spread of factors that you were mentioning before that can potentially influence a child toward autism, of those studies, which one shows the strongest correlation to a child developing autism?
The strongest correlation is maternal and paternal age. So most of the studies show that at an older age of a dad with actually a very young mom, that's the strongest correlation, and then also older for both. So those are the strongest correlations. And then I've seen some studies that show pretty high correlation with proximity to the highway. That was another study that showed pretty strong relationship, and then some of the metals as well.
What would be going on in that situation? Why would having a father of older age and who has a younger spouse, what would be happening that would contribute to autism in that situation?
I don't think we know at this point. I mean, there are some theories, maybe for the older male that's affecting the sperm in some way. So maybe that affects the viability of the sperm, or maybe that affects it in some way that makes it more likely. Maybe that there's just more chemicals and toxins in male who's older or female who's older. So that way it affects the baby, the sperm. I don't know the reason. They don't really know. It's just a theory. And it's really interesting because when the study that I saw, they thought it would be older mom, older dad. And that is still a much higher risk, but actually older dad and really young mom is the highest risk. I don't have a good explanation for why that would be.
I wonder, you mentioned metals there, and this is something we see come up a lot, particularly in relation to, we've all heard the fears around vaccines in the wake of the concerns that have been raised around the mRNA COVID vaccines. We know that parents are more hesitant to get their children vaccinated now. In the scheme of pharmaceuticals, what are the main potential risks, would you say?
Well, I would say the number one potential risk overall is just using pharmaceuticals in general. I mean, I think that we are so quick in medicine to offer medications and we don't take into account the potential side effects. So, we're quick to give antibiotics, which can affect the microbiome. We're quick to give Tylenol. And there is research that shows that moms that take Tylenol during pregnancy have an increased risk of autism in their children. So I don't think that we give enough thought to taking medications. I think it's okay to take a medication if you need it, but I think we need to minimize our use of medications because it obviously affects us and affects our body and for good and bad. And so if we're taking a lot of medications, especially antibiotics, then who knows what kind of downstream effects that have. And the research is starting to show that the more you take medications, the more the kids take medications, the more risk they have for autism. So I think that's one big one. I mean, obviously vaccines, you mentioned it. I think that's something that's been discussed in circles for a long time, and I think it's really frustrating that it's not on the table. I think that we should be discussing everything, and obviously there are more vaccines than ever. So I think if we want to help our kids the most, then we should be leaving everything on the table. We shouldn't take anything off the table in terms of what could be something that's causing or contributing to autism and all chronic disease. And we should be studying this as much as we can.